He thought the woman sitting alone in the last row knew nothing about music, but before the night was over, an entire concert hall would rise to its feet because of her. The Grand Crescent Theater stood at the heart of downtown Chicago, its historic stone exterior glowing beneath the golden light of an autumn evening. Luxury cars lined the street outside. Guests dressed in elegant suits and evening gowns climbed the wide marble steps toward the entrance. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished floors and velvet-covered walls. It was the kind of place where reputation mattered, where talent was celebrated, and where appearances often shaped first impressions before a single word was spoken. Hundreds of guests filled the theater that evening for a prestigious charity concert hosted by the city's most respected classical music society. Conversations floated through the air as people found their seats and admired the magnificent Steinway grand piano resting alone beneath the spotlight at center stage. The instrument seemed almost alive, waiting patiently for the performance to begin. Near the back of the hall, far from the elegant front rows reserved for sponsors and distinguished guests, sat Emily Carter. At 45 years old, she looked entirely ordinary. Her light brown hair was pulled back simply. She wore a modest gray cardigan over a pale blue blouse and dark slacks. No expensive jewelry sparkled beneath the lights. No signs suggested wealth, status, or fame. A small handbag rested beside her seat. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be just another audience member enjoying an evening of music. Yet there was one detail that would have caught the attention of a careful observer. Emily could not stop looking at the piano. While conversations continued around her and guests settled into their seats, her eyes remained fixed on the instrument. Not casually, not with simple admiration. There was something deeper in her gaze. Recognition, memory, longing. Several times she smiled faintly before lowering her eyes again. Then she looked back toward the piano. The expression returned. It was as though the instrument belonged to a chapter of her life that no one else in the room knew existed. A few rows ahead, two guests noticed her behavior and exchanged curious looks. One whispered something to the other. They smiled politely before turning their attention back to the stage. Nobody thought much of it. Nobody had any reason to. Across the theater, musicians completed their preparations backstage, while staff members guided late arrivals to their seats. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Tonight's event featured performances by some of the region's most accomplished classical artists. At the center of it all was Daniel Brooks, the celebrated conductor whose name appeared prominently across every promotional banner in the building. Known for his talent, confidence, and commanding presence, Daniel had built a reputation as one of the most influential figures in the local music community. His opinions carried weight. His praise could elevate careers. His criticism could be equally memorable. As the house lights began to dim, Emily remained quietly seated in the last row. The soft glow from the stage reflected in her eyes as she looked once more toward the Steinway beneath the spotlight. For a brief moment, a complicated mixture of emotions crossed her face. Nostalgia, sadness, affection. Then the expression disappeared. The orchestra members began taking their places. Audience conversations faded. The theater settled into silence. And as the curtain slowly rose, nobody in the hall realized that the quiet woman sitting alone in the last row was carrying a secret capable of changing the entire evening. The first half of the concert unfolded exactly as the audience expected. Accomplished musicians delivered polished performances. Elegant melodies drifted through the theater while guests listened with appreciation. Applause rose and fell throughout the evening as one artist followed another beneath the warm stage lights. Yet despite the beauty of the music, Emily Carter found herself paying attention to only one thing. The Steinway grand piano remained at center stage between performances, waiting quietly beneath its spotlight. Every time it appeared, her eyes returned to it. She seemed unable to look away. Across the orchestra pit, Daniel Brooks stood confidently before the audience. At 52 years old, he carried the kind of presence that naturally attracted attention. His silver-streaked hair, tailored tuxedo, and commanding posture reflected decades of success. As conductor and host of the evening's event, he moved comfortably between performances, speaking with charm and confidence. The audience admired him. Many aspiring musicians viewed him as a gatekeeper to opportunity. Daniel noticed details others often missed. That evening, he happened to notice the woman seated alone near the back of the theater. During a brief pause between performances, his attention drifted toward the audience. Most faces reflected admiration for the musicians on stage. One face stood out. Emily was looking directly at the piano again. Not casually, intently. Daniel followed her gaze. Then he smiled slightly. Standing nearby, one of the event organizers noticed. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded toward the back row. "The woman in the gray cardigan." The organizer looked. "What about her?" Daniel shrugged. "She has been staring at that piano all evening." The organizer glanced again. "Perhaps she enjoys music." Daniel laughed softly. Perhaps. Yet something about the situation amused him. In his experience, true musicians carried themselves differently. They dressed differently. They belonged to certain circles. The woman in the back row looked more like a school teacher attending a community fundraiser than someone connected to the world of elite classical performance. The assumption formed easily. Meanwhile, Emily remained completely unaware of the attention. Her focus stayed fixed on the instrument. Memories drifted through her mind with every passing minute. Long practice sessions, concert halls, standing ovations, faces she had not seen in years. The emotions arrived quietly and disappeared just as quickly. She never shared them. She simply sat alone and listened. As another performance concluded, applause filled the theater once more. Daniel returned to center stage to introduce the next segment of the program. The audience settled immediately. He smiled and thanked everyone for supporting the charity event. Then an unexpected interruption occurred. A stage technician appeared briefly from backstage and whispered something into his ear. Daniel's expression changed. The scheduled pianist for the next performance had encountered a sudden issue and would be delayed. It was not a disaster, but it created an awkward gap in the program. The audience sensed something was happening. Murmurs spread quietly through the hall. Daniel considered his options. He could delay the schedule. He could move another performance forward. Then his eyes drifted once again toward the last row. There sat Emily, still watching the piano. Playful idea entered his mind. To him, it seemed harmless. A light-hearted way to entertain the audience while the situation was resolved. He smiled to himself. Nearby organizers noticed the expression and looked curious. Daniel adjusted his microphone and stepped toward the front of the stage. Hundreds of guests watched attentively. Then his gaze settled directly on Emily Carter. And without realizing it, he was only moments away from making the biggest mistake of the entire evening. Daniel Brooks smiled into the microphone as the audience waited for an explanation regarding the unexpected delay. The atmosphere remained relaxed. Most guests assumed a brief announcement was coming. Instead, Daniel glanced toward the last row of the theater and made a decision that immediately captured everyone's attention. "Well," he said with a light laugh, "it appears we have a few unexpected minutes to fill." Several audience members smiled politely. Daniel continued, "I have noticed someone in the back who seems particularly fascinated by our piano tonight." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Heads began turning toward the rear of the hall. Emily Carter looked up, confused. For a moment, she did not realize he was speaking about her. Then Daniel pointed gently in her direction. "You, ma'am." Hundreds of eyes immediately followed his gesture. Emily froze. A spotlight operator, assuming this was part of the program, allowed a soft beam of light to drift toward her section. The attention made her visibly uncomfortable. Daniel laughed again. "You have been watching that Steinway all evening." A few people chuckled. Emily offered a small, uncertain smile. "I am sorry." "No need to apologize," Daniel replied. "In fact, perhaps you would like to play it for us." Laughter spread through the theater. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that follows a joke everyone believes is harmless. Several audience members exchanged amused looks. A few smiled sympathetically toward Emily. To most people, the suggestion was obviously playful. Daniel never expected her to accept. He simply wanted to entertain the audience while buying time. Emily remained seated. Her expression was calm, though something had changed in her eyes. Memories seemed to pass through her mind once again. The stage, the lights, the piano. Emotions she had spent years keeping private suddenly felt much closer. Daniel continued smiling. "Come on. We could all use a little surprise tonight." More laughter followed. The audience expected Emily to politely decline. That would be the end of it. Even Daniel assumed exactly that. Yet Emily did not answer immediately. She looked toward the piano. Then she looked back at the conductor. The theater seemed strangely quiet. Daniel tilted his head. "Only if you want to, of course." A woman seated nearby whispered to her husband. Several guests leaned forward. Something about Emily's hesitation felt unusual. She was not embarrassed. She was thinking. That difference became noticeable. Emily slowly stood from her seat. The movement immediately changed the mood inside the theater. The laughter faded. People exchanged puzzled glances. Daniel's smile weakened slightly. He had not expected this. Emily adjusted the strap of her handbag and looked toward the stage. "Are you serious?" she asked calmly. The question caught Daniel off guard. The audience laughed again, though less confidently than before. Daniel felt obligated to continue. "Absolutely," he replied. "If you would like to." Emily studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "All right." The single word transformed the atmosphere. A hush swept across the hall. Several audience members sat upright. Others exchanged confused looks. No one had expected her to agree. Daniel blinked. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared on his face. Yet it was too late to retreat gracefully. Hundreds of people were watching. "Wonderful," he said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. "Please join us." Emily began moving toward the aisle. The theater grew quieter with every step she took. There was no sign of anger, no sign of nervousness. She simply walked forward with a calmness that seemed completely out of place. Audience members watched in silence as she made her way down the long center aisle. The Steinway waited beneath the spotlight. Daniel remained standing beside it, suddenly unsure whether he was witnessing a harmless joke or something entirely different. And as Emily Carter approached the stage, the feeling spread throughout the theater that the evening was no longer unfolding according to anyone's expectations. Emily Carter climbed the steps to the stage with a calmness that made the audience increasingly uneasy. The farther she walked, the more the atmosphere changed. Moments earlier, people had been smiling at what they believed was a harmless joke. Now the laughter had nearly disappeared. Something about her composure felt unexpected. Most people who found themselves suddenly standing before hundreds of strangers would appear nervous. Emily did not. Her movements were steady. Her breathing remained relaxed. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that did not seek attention yet somehow commanded it. Daniel Brooks stepped aside as she approached the Steinway. Up close, he noticed details he had missed from across the theater. There was no confusion in her expression, no embarrassment, no attempt to impress anyone. Instead, there was familiarity. It was the look of someone returning to a place she had known long ago. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Emily stopped beside the piano and rested her fingertips lightly against the polished black surface. For a brief moment, she simply stood there. The theater fell completely silent. Even the staff members near the curtains seemed frozen. The instrument reflected the warm stage lights across its glossy finish. Emily looked at the keys without touching them. Her eyes softened. Memories drifted through her mind. Concert halls larger than this one. Years of discipline. Early mornings. Late nights. The language of music that had once defined her entire world. Then she quietly pulled out the piano bench and sat down. The simple action somehow made the room even quieter. Daniel remained nearby, microphone lowered at his side. He told himself there was nothing unusual happening. Yet a growing feeling of uncertainty settled into his chest. The audience sensed it too. Hundreds of faces watched without speaking. Emily adjusted the bench slightly. Then she placed both hands gently above the keyboard. The movement was so natural that several musicians backstage exchanged confused looks. Professional pianists moved that way. People who spent years studying an instrument moved that way. Not casual hobbyists. Not audience volunteers. Emily closed her eyes for a second. The theater seemed to hold its breath. Daniel suddenly wondered whether he should stop this. Perhaps the delayed performer would arrive at any moment. Perhaps they should simply continue the program. But interrupting now would feel awkward. The audience was fully invested. Every eye remained fixed on the woman who had entered the evening as a complete stranger. Emily opened her eyes and looked across the hall. Her gaze moved slowly over the audience before settling briefly on the conductor. There was no resentment in her expression. No desire to embarrass him. Only kindness. That made Daniel even more uncomfortable. He found himself looking away first. A hush settled over the room so complete that the distant hum of the theater's ventilation system became audible. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily lowered her hands toward the keyboard. Her fingertips hovered just above the ivory keys. Somewhere in the audience, a woman clasped her hands together. A man leaned forward in his seat. The musicians backstage watched from behind the curtain. Time seemed to slow. Then, with the entire theater waiting in suspense, Emily Carter finally touched the piano. The first note floated into the theater so softly that several audience members wondered if they had imagined it. Then came a second note. Then a third. Within seconds, every doubt in the room began to dissolve. The sound emerging from the Steinway was not the uncertain playing of an amateur unexpectedly seated at a concert piano. It was something entirely different. Emily Carter touched the keys with extraordinary precision and grace. Every movement appeared effortless. Every phrase carried purpose. The music seemed to breathe beneath her hands. A visible change swept across the audience. People who had expected awkward mistakes found themselves leaning forward instead. Conversations that had quietly lingered in distant corners disappeared completely. Even those with little knowledge of classical music sensed something remarkable unfolding before them. Daniel Brooks stood motionless beside the stage. The confident smile he had worn only minutes earlier vanished. His eyes remained fixed on Emily's hands as they moved across the keyboard. Years of experience allowed him to recognize technical mastery immediately. The touch, the control, the interpretation. These were not skills developed casually. They reflected decades of discipline. Decades. The realization arrived slowly and then all at once. He had misjudged her completely. Emily continued playing. The melody grew richer, more confident, more emotional. Every note seemed connected to a memory only she could see. The theater faded around her. The audience faded. Even Daniel faded from her awareness. There was only the music. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to disappear into it completely. The Steinway responded beautifully. Warm tones filled the hall. Delicate passages flowed into powerful harmonies. Listeners who had arrived expecting a pleasant charity concert now found themselves experiencing something deeply personal. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. One elderly woman quietly wiped away tears forming in her eyes. A young music student seated near the front stared in disbelief. He had spent years studying piano and immediately understood the level of artistry unfolding before him. This was not merely talent. This was greatness. Backstage, musicians gathered near the curtain opening. One violinist whispered softly, "Who is she?" No one had an answer. Yet the question spread rapidly among performers and organizers. Nobody seemed to know the identity of the woman commanding the theater from the piano bench. The mystery only deepened the impact. Daniel's discomfort continued growing. He replayed the last several minutes in his mind. The joke, the laughter, the audience, the invitation. What had seemed amusing earlier now felt painfully different. Yet Emily showed no sign of resentment. She was not performing to prove anyone wrong. That became increasingly clear. Her focus remained entirely on the music itself. The purity of that intention made the moment even more powerful. As the piece continued, The atmosphere inside the Grand Crescent Theater transformed completely. The audience no longer viewed Emily as a stranger from the back row. They no longer saw the gray cardigan or the modest handbag. Those details had become irrelevant. All they saw now was extraordinary artistry. The woman they had overlooked only moments earlier had become the center of the entire evening. And as the melody soared into a breathtaking passage that left listeners holding their breath, a single realization settled over the hall. Whatever happened next, nobody would ever forget the moment Emily Carter touched that piano. The breathtaking passage seemed to suspend time itself. Emily Carter's hands moved across the keyboard with quiet confidence, guiding the music through layers of emotion that no one in the theater had expected to experience that evening. The melody expanded, filling every corner of the Grand Crescent Theater with warmth, sorrow, hope, and beauty. Audience members who had arrived as strangers now shared the same silence. No one checked a phone. No one whispered. No one shifted in a seat. They simply listened. Daniel Brooks felt the atmosphere changing around him in a way he had witnessed only a handful of times throughout his career. Great performances entertained people. Extraordinary performances transformed them. Emily was doing something far rarer. She was telling a story without speaking a single word. Every phrase seemed connected to a memory. Every note carried meaning beyond technical perfection. Even those with little understanding of classical music could feel it. The emotional honesty behind the performance was impossible to ignore. In the front rows, several donors sat motionless, completely captivated. A retired music professor slowly removed his glasses and stared toward the stage in disbelief. He had spent 40 years teaching piano performance. He understood exactly what he was hearing. "Impossible," he whispered softly. Nearby, a young conservatory student watched with wide eyes. Earlier that evening, she had dreamed of one day performing on prestigious stages. Now she found herself witnessing the level of artistry that most musicians spend entire lifetimes chasing. Backstage, more performers gathered behind the curtain. The delayed pianist had finally arrived and stood among them. Yet instead of preparing to take the stage, he remained frozen, listening alongside everyone else. His expression revealed equal parts admiration and astonishment. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was happening. Emily remained completely absorbed in the music. Years seemed to disappear from her face. The reserved woman who had quietly entered the theater alone had become someone else entirely. Not a different person, but a fuller version of herself. A version that existed only when she sat before a piano. The instrument responded to her touch as though it recognized her. Gentle passages flowed into powerful crescendos. Delicate melodies blossomed into rich harmonies. The audience traveled with her through every emotion. Daniel felt a growing sense of humility. Earlier, he had assumed he understood the woman sitting in the last row. He had created an entire story about her based on a few seconds of observation. Now that assumption felt painfully small. The realization settled heavily in his mind. Talent did not announce itself. Greatness did not always arrive wearing expensive clothes or carrying impressive titles. Sometimes it entered quietly through the back doors and sat unnoticed among the crowd. As Emily approached the final section of the piece, the emotional intensity deepened even further. The music no longer sounded like a performance. It sounded like a homecoming. Something lost had been rediscovered. Something forgotten had returned. A hush settled over the theater unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Hundreds of people sat perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement might break the spell. And as Emily guided the melody toward its final moments, one truth became impossible to deny. The woman everyone had overlooked was not simply a gifted pianist. She was someone whose connection to music ran far deeper than anyone in that hall could yet imagine. The final movement approached with the quiet inevitability of a sunset. Emily Carter guided the music through its closing passages with extraordinary control, allowing every note to linger just long enough to leave its mark on the hearts of those listening. The Grand Crescent Theater remained completely silent. Hundreds of people sat motionless beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, united by an experience none of them had expected when they entered the building that evening. The melody softened, then softened again. The powerful crescendos gave way to delicate phrases that seemed almost fragile. Yet beneath that gentleness lived a depth of emotion that reached every corner of the hall. Emily's hands moved effortlessly across the keyboard. There was no display of ego, no attempt to impress. Only honesty, pure, unguarded honesty expressed through music. Daniel Brooks found himself unable to look away. The embarrassment he felt had transformed into something more profound. Respect. Genuine respect. He had spent decades surrounded by musicians, evaluating talent, judging performances, and shaping careers. Yet standing there beside the stage, he realized he was witnessing one of the most meaningful performances of his entire life. Not because of technical perfection alone, although that was undeniable. What moved him was the humanity behind every note. Emily was not merely playing music. She was sharing a part of herself she had hidden from the world for years. The audience felt it too. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Others sat with expressions of wonder. Some seemed lost in their own memories as the music awakened emotions they had not expected to revisit. The concert had become something far greater than entertainment. It had become connection. As the final theme returned, softer now and filled with tenderness, the atmosphere inside the theater changed once more. The mystery surrounding Emily deepened. People no longer wondered whether she was talented. That question had long been answered. Now they wanted to know who she was. How could someone possess this level of artistry and remain completely unknown to everyone in the room? Backstage, musicians exchanged whispered conversations. A few older performers studied Emily carefully. There was something familiar about her. A distant memory lingered at the edge of recognition. Yet no one could quite place it. Emily continued playing, unaware of the questions spreading throughout the theater. Her focus remained entirely on the music. The final passage approached. Slowly, gracefully, she guided the melody toward its conclusion. The last notes floated through the air like fading light at the end of a beautiful day. Then came the final chord. Warm, resonant, perfectly balanced. The sound lingered beneath the high ceiling for several seconds before slowly disappearing into silence. Emily lowered her hands from the keyboard. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Daniel had ever experienced. It was not uncertainty. It was not confusion. It was awe. For several long moments, the entire theater simply stared at the woman seated at the piano bench. Emily remained still, her expression calm and peaceful. Then, somewhere near the center of the audience, an elderly man suddenly rose to his feet. He began applauding. A second person stood. Then a third. Within seconds, the entire theater was rising together. And as hundreds of people stood in admiration, a realization began spreading through the crowd. The woman they had assumed was an ordinary guest was clearly someone whose story had not yet been fully revealed. The standing ovation continued far longer than anyone expected. Applause thundered through the Grand Crescent Theater as hundreds of people remained on their feet, unwilling to let the moment end. Emily Carter sat quietly at the piano bench, almost overwhelmed by the reaction. She had not stepped onto the stage seeking recognition. She had simply responded to an invitation. Yet now the entire hall seemed determined to express its gratitude. The applause rolled on in wave after wave. Some audience members smiled through tears. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Daniel Brooks stood motionless near the edge of the stage. The admiration he felt was now accompanied by an urgent question. Who was she? The answer seemed impossible to ignore any longer. Several musicians backstage shared the same curiosity. Among them stood an elderly violinist named Arthur Reynolds, a performer whose career stretched back more than 4 decades. He had listened to every note of Emily's performance from behind the curtain. As the applause continued, he stepped forward slowly, studying her face beneath the stage lights. Then something changed in his expression. His eyes widened. He took another step closer. "It cannot be," he whispered. A younger musician beside him looked confused. Arthur continued staring toward the piano. Memories surfaced from many years earlier. International competitions, prestigious concert halls, newspaper articles. A gifted young pianist whose performances had once captivated audiences across the world. Suddenly the face before him no longer belonged to a stranger. Recognition struck him completely. Without thinking, Arthur moved onto the stage. The audience gradually noticed. Applause softened. Curious eyes followed him as he approached the piano. Emily looked up and immediately recognized him. A warm smile appeared on her face. Arthur stopped several feet away. For a moment he seemed almost speechless. Then he laughed softly in disbelief. Emily Carter? The theater grew quiet. Daniel turned toward them. Audience members exchanged puzzled looks. Emily nodded gently. Hello, Arthur. The simple exchange sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Arthur shook his head and smiled. I knew it. I knew I recognized your playing. Daniel stepped forward. You know her? Arthur looked at him as though the answer should have been obvious. Know her? He laughed again. 20 years ago, every serious musician in America knew who Emily Carter was. A wave of whispers spread across the audience. Daniel stared at Emily. Arthur continued. She was one of the most celebrated concert pianists of her generation. International competitions, Carnegie Hall, European tours, major recordings. Critics called her one of the brightest talents in classical music. The theater became completely silent. Hundreds of people struggled to process what they were hearing. Emily lowered her eyes modestly. She looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The woman he had treated as the subject of a joke had once performed on some of the world's most prestigious stages. The realization left him speechless. Arthur looked back toward Emily. Then one day you disappeared. Emily's smile softened. Life changed. Arthur nodded respectfully. No further explanation was needed. The simplicity of the answer somehow carried more weight than a detailed story ever could. Around the theater, audience members stared at Emily with entirely new eyes. Yet what amazed them most was not her past success. It was the fact that she had entered the building without mentioning any of it. She had sat quietly in the last row while no one recognized her. She had carried her accomplishments with complete humility. And in that moment, everyone in the hall realized they had witnessed something far greater than extraordinary talent. They had witnessed extraordinary character. The revelation settled over the Grand Crescent Theater like a wave. For several moments, nobody seemed capable of speaking. The audience looked at Emily Carter with entirely different eyes. Yet what made the discovery so powerful was not the list of accomplishments Arthur Reynolds had shared. It was the contrast between who she had been and how she had chosen to live now. She had entered the theater alone. She had taken a seat in the last row. She had never mentioned her past. She had never asked for recognition. The greatness everyone now admired had been sitting quietly among them all evening. Daniel Brooks felt the weight of that truth more than anyone. Standing before the audience, he replayed every assumption he had made. He remembered the joke. He remembered the laughter. He remembered believing he understood who Emily was after observing her for only a few seconds. The realization left him deeply humbled. Slowly, he stepped toward the piano. The theater watched in complete silence. Emily rose from the bench and turned toward him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel took a breath. Emily, he said quietly, his voice carrying through the hall. I owe you an apology. The audience remained still. Daniel continued. Tonight I believed I was being playful. The truth is that I made assumptions about someone I did not know. I judged you before I understood anything about you. That was wrong. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Emily listened without interruption. Daniel shook his head slightly. I have spent my career around talent, and somehow I forgot one of the most important lessons. Greatness does not always announce itself. The room remained silent. Then Emily smiled gently. It was the same calm smile she had worn throughout the evening. There was no anger in it, no desire for revenge, only understanding. Thank you, Daniel. she said softly. We all make assumptions sometimes. The simplicity of her response seemed to touch everyone in the theater. She could have embarrassed him. She could have reminded everyone of the joke. Instead, she chose grace. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before smiling with genuine respect. Around the hall, people began applauding again. This time the applause felt different. It was not only admiration for musical brilliance. It was admiration for character. Arthur Reynolds stepped forward and shook Emily's hand. Musicians emerged from backstage to greet her. Students asked for photographs. Audience members thanked her for the experience she had given them. Through it all, Emily remained exactly the same person who had entered the building hours earlier. Humble, kind, unassuming. Eventually the crowd began to disperse. The evening drew to a close. Guests slowly made their way toward the exits while conversations filled the lobby. Yet nearly every conversation centered on the same lesson. Not the performance itself, the lesson behind it. As Emily prepared to leave, she paused one final time beside the Steinway. Her fingertips brushed lightly against the polished surface. A quiet smile crossed her face. Then she picked up her handbag and walked toward the exit. No entourage followed her. No spotlight accompanied her. She simply disappeared into the cool Chicago evening. Behind her, the theater remained filled with people who would remember that night for years to come. Not because they had witnessed a famous pianist return to the stage, but because they had been reminded of something far more important. The people we overlook may carry extraordinary stories. The people we underestimate may possess remarkable gifts. And sometimes the greatest talent in the room is sitting quietly in the last row, waiting for the world to look beyond appearances. And that night, an entire hall remembered what true greatness looks like.